Hello and welcome to this special series on population, environment and development. Today we are discussing about demography of adaptation to climate change. Now climate change is increasingly recognized as a major challenge facing households and communities, local and national governments and international agencies and organizations. The Earth's climate has already been altered to such an extent that mitigation, that is, efforts to reduce the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere alone will be inadequate. Therefore, adaptation, that is responding to the impacts of climate change, is increasingly necessary. Budget for adaptation are increasing, programs are expanding and political infrastructure is being negotiated and implemented. In the meantime, significant advances have been made in the development of adaptation programs. Yet to this point, existing approaches have serious limitations. In the midst of a rapidly expanding global adaptation agenda, it is of primary importance to get adaptation and its constituent parts right in order to generate the most appropriate and effective interventions. This module also addresses a major gap in adaptation efforts to date by pointing out the vital role that an understanding of population dynamics has in developing effective adaptation policies and practices. It examines the key components of climate change, vulnerability and adaptation and assesses the ways in which these interact with population dynamics. Current limitation in approaches to adaptation. Since the recognition of adaptation as one of the core pillars of global response to climate change along with mitigation, technology transfer and financing, there has been a rapid growth of interest in the topic and a rapid expansion in the development and implementation of adaptation projects. The overwhelming scientific consensus on the causes and likely effects of climate change suggests that much of this adaptation activity has been driven by a sense of urgency to safeguard the lives and livelihoods of people living in particularly vulnerable countries. However, these expansion efforts have often taken place without a broader understanding of the drivers of social change, with the result that several key limitations can be identified. First, perspective on vulnerability have often been superficial, overly general and deterministic. Direct translation of vulnerability to climate change solely from economic, social or political factor is common without full consideration of what that translation may mean. Adaptation and poverty reduction are not the same thing, and while vulnerability associated with poverty is related to climate vulnerability, the two do not overlap perfectly. As a result of this mistranslation, practitioners frequently list vulnerable groups, example women, children, elderly, indigenous groups or disabled people, rather than specifying the underlying mechanisms that create vulnerability. Members of these groups may indeed have heightened vulnerability to the impacts of climate change, but specifying a framework for understanding and addressing that vulnerability is essential. One of the purposes of this module is to fill this gap. Meanwhile, the effects of climate change are likely to increase. Despite even greater uncertainty as to its exact form and outcomes, climate change must be the most striking environmental trend of our time. The dominant view in scientific circles is that the negative impacts of climate change over the course of the century will be large but unevenly distributed both spatially and socially. The contributors to climate change are likely to remain concentrated in wealthier parts of the world, though some of the largest increases in emissions are apt to be in the urbanizing and industrializing Asia. The worst impacts, however, are expected to be in relatively poor countries, including many in Africa and Asia that are experiencing rapid urban growth. It is impossible at this time to predict more than roughly what environmental impact climate change will have in different localities, let alone how this impact will influence migratory flows. Not only will climate change have its effect on migration in combination with a range of other economic and political factors, but actions taken in response to climate change may have just as large an effect on migration as the direct physical impacts of climate change. Thus, for example, rural biofuel plantations promoted to mitigate climate change could accelerate rural urban migration by displacing rural smallholders. Similarly, the construction of infrastructure to produce renewable energy such as dams and infrastructure to protect against floods and other extreme weather events could have significant impacts on local livelihoods and displace large number of people. Also, urban building regulations promoted to reduce carbon emissions could inhibit rural urban migration by increasing the cost of urban living, although their effects on carbon emission may end up being rather minimal. The extent to which such measures which harm already disadvantaged groups will dominate over more positive measures and will depend on how much influence such groups have in policy arena. Perhaps a more fruitful way to assess the impacts of climate change on population distribution is to focus on livelihood opportunities rather than mobility per se. From this perspective, mobility is a form of diversification of income sources. This in turn helps explain mobility's diversity, especially with regards to destinations, duration of stay and the composition of migrant flows, all of which are central to developing appropriate support policies. Overall, there is a growing consensus among urban economists that urbanization and mobility are integral to economic growth, in clear and increasingly sharp contrast with the policymakers' pessimistic views. This does not mean, of course, that simply increasing urbanization and mobility will increase economic growth or productivity. However, arbitrary attempts to curb urbanization or interfere with mobility are not only likely to reduce economic growth, but are also apt to interfere with people's attempt to diversify their livelihoods, cope with uncertainty and achieve resilience in the face of climatic change. Climate changes is expected to alter precipitation patterns and increase the aridity of many of the world's drylands. From the perspective of climate adaptation, the question of whether dryland population should be concentrated in urban areas is quite different from that of whether urban centers should be concentrated in the drylands. All other things being equal, it is preferable if urban populations are not located in drylands, where they may be exposed to water shortages and be forced to compete for scarce water supplies. On the other hand, there are various water related reasons why it may make sense for rural dryland populations to move to local urban centers, particularly when population densities are high and agriculture is causing environmental degradation. Especially where there is a risk of desertification, it may also make sense for a government to encourage urban development rather than agriculture intensification in drylands. In China, there are large areas where urbanization is being promoted as a response to dryland degradation. The situation in Ordos, a municipality in Inner Mongolia with a population of about 1.6 million, provides an extreme example of some of the issues involved. This water scarce and energy rich city region is urbanizing extremely rapidly, spurred on by both the booming energy based economy and ambitious efforts to protect rural ecosystem, which involve substantial government subsidies for many of those who have moved from rural to urban location in the drylands. The rural population in Ordos declined from 9,35,000 in 2000 to about 5 lakh at the end of 2009, with commensurate increases in urban population. This government promoted ecological migration may indeed reduce pressures on rural environments. However, from a narrow environmental perspective, it would probably make more sense to allow urban investment and rural urban migration to flow to alternative locations away from these fragile drylands. This would nevertheless raise very serious political concern, as it would entail not only pushing local farmers and herders, including many ethnic Mongolians, out of the rural areas, but out of their homelands as well. Most drylands are far less arid than Ordos, and outside of China, government led ecological urbanization, and it is rare. All drylands are characterized by low rainfall relative to evaporation, however, which constrain agriculture and biological productivity generally and can make it difficult to secure sufficient water for domestic purposes. Overall, drylands cover 40% of the world's land area and in 2000 contained about a third of the world urban population and also about a third of its rural population. More recent estimates for the same year suggest that in Asia, about 0.54 billion out of 1.49 billion urban dwellers lived in drylands, while in Africa it is about 0.13 billion out of 0.28 billion. A recent assessment of water resources shortages in cities of Africa, Asia and Latin America with populations greater than 1 lakh was estimated that in 2000, 150 million city dwellers faced perennial water resource shortages, that is less than 100 liters per capita per day within their urban extents, and this figure is projected to grow to 993 million by the year 2050. Most cities divert water from rural sources, however, and even in Africa, these distances have been increasing substantially. In recognition of this, the assessment also estimated the population that would still face water shortage if the city would obtain water from within 100 kilometers. Under this measure, only 24 million faced water shortage in the year 2000, rising to 162 million in the year 2050, that is estimated. In these projections, urban population growth is the main driver, but climate change is a contributing factor and is growing in importance. All such estimates are highly uncertain, but they do point out what could potentially be extremely severe problems. One of the biggest urban dangers, alongside that of severe ecological and agricultural disruptions, is that water scarcity will prevent people from securing adequate water to meet their basic needs. As with coastal settlements, it needs to be recognized that not all groups will be burdened equally, and the adaptation efforts that try to prevent people from living in exposed cities could make matters worse. The water scarcity estimates above relate to water resource availability, and in many cities, low income residents, especially those in informal settlements, cannot secure access to improved water supplies even when local water resources are plentiful. Such households often lack access to the urban piped water network and depend on less reliable, less convenient, less healthy and sometimes considerable more expensive supplies. Some informal settlements are far from the piped network, while others may be refused access because they are on land that they do not own or on which residential development is not formally allowed. In some cities, there are fears that if informal settlements are provided with services such as piped water, more migration and illicit settlement will be encouraged. In effect, exclusionary policies are actually helping to create the hazards, and using them to shift people away from hazards is likely to be counterproductive. Almost a third of the urban households in Africa and Asia rely on groundwater from wells or around their homes. A disproportionate share of these are low-income households who are more likely to depend on shallow wells affected by local rainfall patterns and surface water flows, and to be unable to draw on distant supplies should local water resources be depleted. At the same time, there are often high levels of water being wasted by a small number of consumers and high share of unaccounted for water. Such conditions make it both particularly important and particularly difficult to develop more efficient urban water systems that are more equitable within urban areas as well as between rural and urban areas. As in relation to coastal hazards, unless urban land issues are addressed, it is difficult to see how an equitable adaptation effort could be mounted. In particular, if discouraging settlement in dryland cities were to become part of an adaptation strategy, the water supply problems faced by the most vulnerable households could be compounded. As with the settlement of the flood plains, the use of vulnerable water supplies is already linked to a form of exclusion. An objection could be raised that resolving land issues in exposed cities will attract people to these cities. Moreover, if the measures are funded centrally rather than locally, the cost differentials that might otherwise help to drive people and enterprises away from hazardous cities will be attenuated. It is true that like many measures that help cities in hazardous locations adapt to climate change, resolving land issues will also make these cities more attractive to live in. The effect on migration is difficult to predict. However, in any case, with respect to land issues, the obvious response is to fund the measures locally, or better still, to resolve land issues in less hazardous locations as well, rather than to let them continue to fester in exposed cities. Although the term environmental refugees was first used in the late 1970s, it is only recently that it has become a relatively common notion. In the wake of the emergent understanding of the impacts of climate change on natural ecosystems, a growing body of evidence suggests that environmental change, including flooding, changes in rainfall patterns, higher temperatures and more frequent extreme weather events, will almost certainly influence migration and mobility increasingly. However, contrary to earlier predictions, it is unlikely to result in mass movements across borders and from low income countries to wealthier ones. While extreme weather events will cause displacements, current evidence suggests that these may be short term and short distance, depending primarily on the capacity of communities and local institutions to provide effective coping support. In turn, slow onset global environmental change is predicted to affect migration indirectly through its impact on the key socio-economic and political drivers of mobility. The majority of these movements are likely to take place within national borders, reflecting the general patterns of migration worldwide, with international migrants estimated to account for only about 3% of the world's population against almost 11% of internal migrants. Recent research in environmentally fragile rural areas in Bolivia, Senegal and the United Republic of Tanzania goes further in exploring the impacts of environmental degradation on migration and mobility patterns. It shows desertification, soil degradation and disrupted rainfall patterns do indeed deeply affect livelihoods of rural people who rely primarily on natural resources. In addition, the research suggests that in many cases it is possible to identify precipitating events such as unusually harsh droughts and epidemics of livestock disease, which have a long lasting impact on local economies and livelihoods. What is crucial in making these events so catastrophic is a socio-economic context which restricts people's ability to rely on well-tested strategies and diversify their activities within both the agricultural and non-farm sectors. The undermining of the local opportunities that have traditionally ensured resilience in areas where the environment is fragile and subject to cyclic disruptions has resulted in growing climate sensitivity and deeper impacts of specific climate hazards. In the United Republic of Tanzania, Maasai villagers describe the prolonged dry season of 1997 that was followed by El Nino related floods in 1998 as a turning point in their traditional way of life. The related outbreaks of Rift Valley fever between the year 2000 and 2002 decimated cattle already weakened by scarce rainfall. Drought returned in the year 2009 and 2010, making it difficult to find water and good pasture. The cattle death rate was so high that, in the words of Maasai, it was not unusual to wake up in the morning and find that 5 to 10 animals had died overnight. This resulted in a glut in the market, with farmers anxious to sell their animals before the disease and malnutrition killed them all. At the same time, conflicts of interest between different land users in Maasai areas linked to increasing land value continued to escalate. Under the Land Act of 1999, traditional pasture land was in many cases classed as unoccupied or unused, and thus fell under the exclusive control of central government, which was then able to allocate it to private or foreign investors for large scale commercial farming. This obliged Maasai farmers to move further away looking for water and pasture, thus undermining their traditional responses to environmental degradation. As a result, many of them turned to sedentary farming, while growing number of young men migrated to the cities. In all such cases, mobility has long been a traditional coping strategy for people living in fragile environments. While there is a little doubt about environmental degradation that has become more severe in extreme events such as droughts have become more frequent, their impact has also become more severe as non-environmental factors have undermined alternative local economic opportunities. As a result, migration and mobility have become much more widespread and diverse. Perhaps more important, they have become a crucial part of local livelihoods. In all the case study locations in United Republic of Tanzania and other countries, the most vulnerable households were unanimously identified as those who do not migrate or receive remittances from migrant relatives. So let us now summarize the whole module. There has been a rapid growth of interest in the topic and a rapid expansion in the development and implementation of adaptation projects. The overwhelming scientific consensus on the causes and the likely effects of climate change suggests that much of this adaptation activity has been driven by a sense of urgency to safeguard the lives and livelihoods of people living in particularly vulnerable countries. Perhaps a more fruitful way to assess the impacts of climate change on population distribution is to focus on livelihood opportunities rather than mobility per se. From this perspective, mobility is a form of diversification of income sources. Studies show that desertification, soil degradation and disrupted rainfall patterns do indeed deeply affect the livelihoods of rural people who rely primarily on natural resources. In addition, the research suggests that in many cases it is possible to identify precipitating events such as unusually harsh droughts and epidemics of livestock diseases, which have a long lasting impact on local economies and livelihoods. Thank you so much for watching.